Hi guys, my name is Hersh Mehta. A lot of you already know me. This is my third time being up here. So I gave a talk on weight training and on astrophotography before this, and now today we're gonna talk about Indian philosophy. Specifically, I'm gonna do an introduction to Indian philosophy. So the original subtitle of this talk was a walk through 5,000 years of Indian philosophical thought. And then I was practicing this, and I realized it felt more like a jog, not a walk. So yeah, during the first half of the talk, I'm going to sort of set up some background of various Indian philosophical thought and give a high-level overview of the different systems that have emerged in India. And then in the second half of the talk, we will dig into one particular branch of philosophy and discuss some of the key questions it deals with, as well as how it attempts to answer these questions. So throughout this talk, I'm going to use some Sanskrit words and give you some rough English translations. So if you go and read up about this topic on Wikipedia or in a book somewhere, you're going to encounter these Sanskrit words, and at least you'll have seen them before. As always, feel free to interrupt, ask questions. Although if you ask a lot of questions, this jog might turn into a run towards the end. And then call me out if I say something incorrect.
How will we know?
Deep philosophical question there. Before we get started, it's useful to get some background and understand some context. So India is and always has been a very diverse country. It's a nation of over 1.3 billion people. There's 29 different states, 22 major languages, over 720 different dialects of these languages, dozens of different cuisines. So it should come as no surprise that when we talk about philosophy, there is tons and tons of different systems of philosophy that have flourished in India over the millennia. And so you have kind of this myriad of philosophical studies to choose from, and you kind of pick the one that you like the most. So what are they? So depending on how you count, there's somewhere between 11 to 16 major schools of philosophical thought that have come in India. These can be mostly divided up into these two branches that you see up here. On the left side, we have what is known as the Orthodox or Astika school of thought. And then on the right side, we have what is known as the Heterodox or Gnostica school of thought. Okay. And so there's 6 different major Orthodox schools of thought. And on the right, there are 5 major heterodox schools of thought. We're going to dig into each of these a little bit later on. Suffice it to say, so the big ones on the right-hand side you might have heard of, like Jainism or Buddhism, are highlighted, and the other 3 are grayed out because they don't have many modern followers.
For those of us that are unfamiliar, can you just explain what heterodox versus orthodox is?
That is coming up in the next slide. Yeah, thanks. So most of these schools are formalized somewhere between 1000 BCE and 800 CE. And so what's the main difference between these 2 branches? Well, so, whoops. Okay, apparently if I move my mouse there, I can't scroll either. Okay. So the main difference between the Orthodox schools of thought and the heterodox schools of thought is that the Orthodox schools of thought accept what is generally known as the Vedanta Darshana as the authoritative figure and the basis of their beliefs, whereas the heterodox schools do not. And so what is this thing that is the Vedanta Darshana? Well, so it's a collection of texts primarily comprising of the Vedas that dates back somewhere between 5 to 10,000 years, depending on who you ask. So this is illustrated in this diagram here. The word Veda literally means knowledge. It comes from Sanskrit, the root word being vid, or which is a verb to know. And the Vedas, with a capital V, are thought to be this collection of all knowledge, practical, religious, spiritual, philosophical, that have been distilled and condensed into several thousand hymns. And so these hymns are then split across 4 major texts Rig Veda, Sama Veda, Yajur Veda, and the Athra Veda. So that's on this, as you can see on this diagram. And then each of these texts are then further split into 4 parts. First part being Samhita, then Brahmana, Aryana, and the Upanishads. So the word Vedanta literally translates to the end of the Vedas. And so we get the word Vedanta from the fact that the Vedas are sort of stored as these, told as these stories or actions and rituals, with the interesting philosophical bits of the Vedas coming towards the end in the form of the Upanishads. And so these philosophical thoughts that come at the end of each of the Vedas form the basis of all of these schools of thought that use the Vedanta Darshana as their basis, right? So all of the orthodox schools of thought. So, and then as an aside here, there is the Mahabharata, which you might be familiar with, like the Gita in Hinduism, which is a subset of the Mahabharata, is often referred to as quote unquote the fifth Veda, because a lot of these schools of thought will also derive content from what is in the text known as the Mahabharata. And then there's, at the bottom here in red, I have the Brahma Sutras. I'll dig into what those are later on. But for now, let's just recap where we are. So this is sort of the diagram of the different schools of philosophical thought. For today, we are going to go take a dive down that left branch and dig into the orthodox schools of thought. So before we do that, though, we're going to take a little bit of a detour into epistemology. So let's talk about epistemology, or knowledge and the means through which you acquire knowledge. The Sanskrit word for epistemology is pramana. So in Indian philosophical systems, there are 6 different pramanas, or means for acquiring knowledge. So some of these are self-explanatory, like perception and inference. So perception being whatever knowledge one acquires through their senses, inference. Then there is comparison analogy. So this one appears a lot in Indian philosophies. A lot of the writings rely heavily on metaphors and similes to communicate complex ideas. And there's going to be an example of this much later on in the talk, in the second half. There's also this notion of postulation or derivation from circumstance. The notion of non-perception or a negative proof as being called out separately. And lastly is the word or testimony or shabda. And this is sort of what calling out to the Vedanta Darshana, or what is written in these texts, or calling out to some trusted figure or authority on a given subject matter and what they have written as a result. And so as you can see, some of these are highlighted and others are not. The reason for that is that depending on which of the school of thought you believe in, they will either accept a subset of these pramanas as valid means of acquiring knowledge, or they will accept all of them. Most schools accept the 3 highlighted pramanas. All of the orthodox schools will accept at least those 3, and then maybe some additional ones. So
the heterodox schools also fall within this framework of the 6 pramanas?
Yes. So most of the heterodox schools will either accept perception, inference, and they don't generally accept word, or at least word of the Vedas, right? That's being the key difference.
Okay.
But they might also accept something like comparison or analogy. And yeah, there's a slide that didn't make it through that kind of showed what the heterodox schools accept. Mm-hmm. So with that, let's dig a little bit deeper into the Astika philosophy, or the orthodox philosophy. So there are 2 things that are common across all orthodox philosophies. They accept the Vedas as the authoritative figure, and they are built on top of a premise that there is this notion of the Atman that exists. So there's something that is eternal, whether you call it a soul or something that exists beyond just life and death. Where they differ is in their interpretation of the text that is the Vedas, and how these differences in interpretation that subsequently affect the answers to questions surrounding philosophy, surrounding life, rebirth, the existence of God, the existence of self, and so on. Out of these 6 philosophies, the one in the middle there, the Samkhya philosophy, is the oldest Indian philosophy, thought to be formalized somewhere between the years 800 to 600 BCE. The term Samkhya translates roughly to enumerate or reason by enumeration. These are philosophers that are founded, this philosophy is founded on this notion of strongly dualistic thoughts. So I'll explain what dualism is in detail later on. But for now, it suffices to say that at a very high abstract level, the term dualistic means that they essentially state that all of reality can be comprised of 2 parts, or can be decomposed into 2 things. In the case of the Samkhya philosophers, the decomposition that they go with is what they call the Purusha, or consciousness, and Prakriti, or matter. So they sort of separate consciousness and matter and say everything can be talked of in terms of these 2 things. So the Samkhya philosophers only accept the 3 highlighted pramanas as the valid means of knowledge. And one thing to note here is that they do not make any direct statements about the existence or non-existence of a god, like sort of a religious capital G God. So they don't really consider this relevant for their philosophy, and they don't really talk about it, although commentators have made interpretations based on the writings. And then, so right next to it, the Samkhya philosophers, we have the yoga philosophy. And so this is sort of the philosophical system underlying yoga, if any of you have done yoga. And they're really close in their beliefs to the Samkhya philosophers, but the one key difference between the 2 being that they accept the existence of God, whereas the Samkhyas do not. So I'm not going to dig into all of these in detail. I'm just going to sort of give you brief overviews of them. The Nyaya philosophers on the left date back to somewhere between 600 to 200 BCE. And they are sort of important in the sense that these are the folks that first formalized the theory of logic and methodology in India. And so in doing so, they add upon these 3 pramanas the comparison and analogy as a valid means of gaining knowledge. After this comes the Mimamsa philosophers, the second from the right there. And these guys go on adding postulation as another piece of another pramana through which they can gain knowledge. And this is where sort of the philosophy of language is introduced in India. And so they do a lot of very deep analysis on language and what are the words and what do words mean. And they I read a lot of Mimamsa philosophy during an introduction to philosophy course I took back in college, and it turns out they spend a lot of time sort of talking through symbols. So they'll use symbols like a cow or a fire and table and talk through this. And so just to give you sort of an idea of the types of questions that they're asking when it comes to language, it is like, so for example, when I say the word cow, everybody around here in their mind's eye kind of pictures a cow. Now, do we all have pictures of the same cow, or do we all have pictures of different cows? Are we picturing a cow that we've interacted with that is real and exists in the world external to us? Or are we picturing some conglomeration of all cows that we've seen throughout the history of our lives and experienced and sort of integrating through this domain? Or are we making up a cow, right? Completely out of the blue, imagining some cow that may or may not exist or may not be an integration. So that's kind of like the type of questions they're asking. They're also asking, if I say the word cow and I talk to you, how do I know that you're thinking of the same thing I'm thinking of? Is there something that is quote unquote cowness that is a property that can be attributed to all cows that exist? Alternatively, can we think of this as really the absence of the property of non-cowness across all cows that exist, right? And so that's a lot of setup for this joke. Don't have a cow, man.
How can I know?
Yeah, so they would have loved Art Simpson here. So that's kind of the Mimamsa philosophers in a nutshell and the philosophy of language. So finally, we get to the Vedanta philosophy. The Vedanta school of thought actually can be further subdivided into these 5 subcategories, and we'll dig into each of these. But first, what's common across all of the Vedanta schools of thought? So the Vedanta school of thought is the dominant philosophy of Hinduism in all of these like 5 various forms, and they can kind of be plotted along the spectrum of thought. So on one end, on the left hand here, we have what is known as the Dvaita Vedanta school of thought, or the dualistic Vedanta school of thought. And then on the right hand, we have what is known as the Advaita Vedanta school of thought, or the non-dualistic school, Vedanta school of thought. And then in the middle somewhere is this notion of a Vishishta Advaita Vedanta school of thought, or quote unquote qualified non-dualism. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what they kind of mean later on, but all 5 of these schools of thought are built upon the Vedas, like I mentioned previously, specifically the Upanishads, and they're also built upon the Brahma Sutras. And the Vedanta school of thought accepts all 6 pramanas of knowledge. So I alluded to the Brahma Sutras in my previous diagram. I'm going to try and go back to see if I can. Yeah. So what are the Brahma Sutras? As you can see, like they kind of are being derived from all of the 4 Upanishads from the Vedas, and this is because they are really sort of these summaries of the teachings that are in the Upanishads. They are thought of as being written somewhere between 400 BCE to 200 CE, and most likely during this time span over the course of several hundred years and across multiple authors. And they're really just these cryptic aphorisms that are really difficult to understand. So I thought of flashing some of them on the screen, and then I realized it's all Sanskrit to me. But there are these. The Brahma Sutras are a collection of these 555 short aphorisms, and then they are again further subdivided into 4 chapters, and each chapter is then subdivided into 4 parts. Each part comprises of n what is called andakarnas, and an andakarna is a structured sequence of aphorisms that follow this sort of structure outlined in that little text on the bottom left there, where they introduce a topic or a claim. They sort of describe some doubt around the topic or claim that they're introducing, and then they provide some primary arguments that support the topic or claim, after which they put some structure into these arguments, and then they try to summarize the results and how those results then relate to the other portions of the Brahma Sutras. So with these Brahma Sutras, because they're so hard to understand, comes a collection of commentaries throughout the millennia. And so many philosophers in India have commented on the Brahma Sutras, such as Shankaracharya, Bhaskaracharya, Ramanujacharya, Vallabhacharya, etc. And each of these commentaries attempts to interpret the contents of these aphorisms, and then they also try to provide arguments for their interpretation of the aphorisms and against the interpretation of those that came before. So a nice little tidbit here. So you can see there, the names are slightly different on the diagram than what I said. And that's because I suffixed the term acharya to the end of each of these names. And this comes from the fact that these commentators or these scholars made commentaries on the Brahma Sutras and then subsequently provided examples of how one should live their life according to the teachings that they're commenting on. And so thereby they kind of achieve this notion of acharya, which is Sanskrit for a teacher who leads through example or conduct. And so that's why they get these acharyas suffixed to their names. And so as a result of each of their commentaries, we now end up with a bunch of different subsystems of the Vedanta, and their commentaries form the basis of each of these subsystems of Vedanta thought. So let's kind of walk left to right through that diagram, and then as we go left to right, we are going to also go sort of backwards through time. And so the Dvaita Vedanta school of thought was sort of formalized by Madhava in the 13th century, and that is the dualistic school of thought. The qualified non-dualistic school of thought was formalized based on the writings of Ramanuja around 1000, the year 1000, and then lastly the Advaita Vedanta school of thought, which is formalized by Adi Shankara around 800 CE. And so we're gonna dig into this particular school of thought a little bit, because even though it's the oldest of the Vedanta schools of thought, it is also the most widely followed. And the term Advaita in Sanskrit literally translates into the English, which is one without the other, or non-dual. And so I kind of alluded to what this dualism is this idea that everything is comprised of two or more things, and the idea here that there's trying to subscribe to is that everything, there's just one thing that is the basis of all reality. And so when somebody uses the term quote unquote Indian philosophy or Vedic philosophy or quote unquote Hindu philosophy in a very loose sense, they're probably referring to the set of the Vedanta set of belief systems. In particular, they're probably referring to either the Advaita or the Vishishta Advaita Vedanta belief systems. And I don't know, like the reason I thought that we would dig into this a little bit deeper is because I think it might be the most appealing to this particular audience, in the sense that, and I'm going to be very, very careful in how I use this term, but it is quote unquote compatible with like scientific thinking or modern science. And so I want to say, and the reason I use the term compatible is that like it's not necessarily testable or anything like this, but at least it doesn't say anything that is explicitly like disproven by science, and that's like, you got to clear that bar if you want to be accepted by a bunch of logical thinkers, right?
Scare air quotes, duly noted.
So a side note here, so the terms dualism, non-dualism, qualified non-dualism refer to a framework. So when I say the words Advaita Vedanta, this is the application of this non-dualistic framework of thinking, or think of it like a lens through which you view the world. It is the application of this lens to evaluate the Vedanta body of text, right? And kind of interpreting what is written in this body of text through this particular lens.
So I'm trying to synthesize or figure out where orient myself. The Vedanta texts, they date from like 800 BCE.
The Vedanta, so the Vedas in particular are somewhere around like 5,000 years old. So say like 3000 BCE.
Okay.
Although they have been modified and added upon over the course of history, but that is generally like the sort of earliest or the latest, the newest, closest to the present date that is accepted by all scholars, right? Mm-hmm. Depending on who you ask, like if you ask a truly religious person, they will say the content of the Vedas is timeless in the sense that it was handed down by God, and the Vedas as a body of text as written down in text format might only be 10,000 years old, but that content is much, much older. right?
And then this school of thought that we are digging into more deeply is going to be dated. It's going to be formalized around 800 CE.
Yes.
Okay.
So that is the course of 3,500 years. And during that 3,500 years came the other schools of thought that came before the Vedanta school of thought that I talked about earlier, like the Mimamsa school, the Nyaya school, the Yoga school of thoughts, right? And so all of these schools of thought. So there was a period between like sort of the writing of the Vedas and then the formalization of the philosophy behind the Vedas, right? With these various schools of thought. During which, like, because there was no formalization, like there's just a bunch of these free-floating ideas. Nobody has like a way of tying them all together. Yeah, but this is really where like we start. So with the formalization of logic, or with the formalization of like enumeration, we kind of get into the system of trying to break things down into parts so that we can compartmentalize these free-floating ideas and organize them and provide some structure to them. And then we provide and then this philosophy of logic comes about, and now we have a way through which we can talk about this stuff. After which, in order for us to talk about stuff, there's this philosophy of language that comes about. And so like, what does it mean? And so like, how do I become really precise and articulate with the words that I'm writing? And so if you ever decide to go study Sanskrit is a super, super complicated language. These aphorisms in Sanskrit, the Brahma Sutras are, each of these aphorisms are like 3 words or 2 words or 2.5 words, right? Like they're really short, but it's super dense. And then after we have like sort of this groundwork being laid down by these various philosophers between sort of 1000 BCE to like 500, 600 CE, then comes Adi Shankara in 800 CE and talks about sort of what is really the modern Vedantic philosophical system.
So far.
Yeah, and so we are walking through history, but in our current timeline, that is the modern, we are in 800 CE and we are in sort of what is the cutting edge philosophy of 800 CE. And so I think it's important to note that these things are frameworks because they can be applied to any belief system, whether you're talking about Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Judaism, whatever. And so, for example, like there's a bunch of philosophical commentators out there that talk about the application of non-dualism to Christianity. And they try to support this by quoting passages clearly a computer scientist, passages from the Bible or from the Testaments, and like they try to interpret them through this lens of non-dualism. So let's dig into the Advaita Vedanta. Specifically, we're going to talk about the ontology of the Advaita Vedanta, or the study of being that is put forth by the philosophers of the Advaita Vedanta. So this is really the study of self and existence and like things like that, how they're trying to answer these questions. So as I said, the word Advaita means one without another. And so the philosophy talks about there's being only this one reality. It's really, think of it like this abstract concept represented by the variable x. And so they try to ascribe some properties to this variable x. And the properties that they ascribe are Sat, Chit, Ananda, Rupa, which are Sanskrit, so let's translate them. Sat means the truth. This is the reality. This is the truth. X is the truth. Chit means consciousness. It consists of consciousness. Ananda means bliss or happiness. And Rupa means form or existence. And so these are the set of properties that are ascribed to this concept of X. And then, so when they're making their commentaries about this concept X, they're using a lot of metaphors and similes to justify their reasoning. And so I'm going to make use of some of that through the remainder of this talk. But it's important not to get too bogged down into the details of these similes or metaphors. So the Advaita Vedantins obviously don't use the letter X. They give it a term, and the term that they give it is Brahman. Okay, and so that the Advaita Vedantins state that the Brahman is the only source of all matter, consciousness, and action. It is all of what is known as space, time, and causation is simply a manifestation of this Brahman. And one thing that is of importance to note here is that Brahman is not God. Right? It is not the concept of God as described in religion. So if you're talking about capital G God, or if you're in like Hinduism and there are 33 crore, which is what, something like 3 billion like lowercase g gods. It is not that, right? The term, they use a separate word to describe this concept of God, which is Ishvara. And Ishvara is a subset of Brahman, because Brahman is this abstract concept. Perhaps best illustrated by this pretty picture. So here on the left, we have all the individuals, right? Chip, there's Kevin, there's me, there's Mayhofer. There are a bunch of plants and animals and creatures, and then there's just stuff, right? And then if you're talking about like monotheistic religions, there's this concept of a God. And it's out in the cloud somewhere, right, on AWS. But the important thing is the Advaita Vedantins say there's a broader, bigger cloud of stuff that is Brahman. And then whether you're talking about like sort of the dualistic perspective, which is all these individual entities existing as themselves, or you're talking about some variant of sort of this qualified non-dualistic perspective where all of the existence of consciousness is a subset of individual manifestations of this God. It doesn't really matter. But it doesn't matter how you split this down. For the purposes of the Advaita Vedanta, there's this overarching concept of Brahman that encompasses all this stuff.
The stuff just the non-conscious.
Yeah, the stuff is just the non-conscious table chair, whatever. Right. Yeah.
So this is dualist and non-dualist?
This is my hand wavy interpretation of some of the nuanced differences between the dualist, the qualified non-dualist, the what is the other school of thought?
Overqualified dualists.
Yeah, I mean, there's like Veda, which is the dualist, non-dualist. There's all these like different schools of thought, but like there's very nuanced differences between these schools of thought. But in like you can kind of think of them in this like abstract concept. It doesn't really matter for the purposes of the point is for the Advaita Vedantins, they don't really care. Like the point they're trying to make is there's this abstract concept that can unify all of these things.
This is also a screenshot from Wikipedia.
Totally a screenshot from Wikipedia. That's why it has my name on it. So this is gonna be a little bit dense. So the Advaita Vedantins talked about this Brahman, and they propose a way of realizing this thing called Brahman through a path of knowledge, right? And so the Advaita Vedantins assert that Brahman is the reality. It exists. The only reason you don't think it exists is because of a veil of ignorance that is blocking you from viewing this reality. And so they state that, well, what is the best way to get rid of ignorance? It is through the acquisition of knowledge. And therefore, we're going to go down this path of acquiring knowledge about Brahman and through that try and remove this veil of ignorance that exists. And so the question that, so all of like these writings are sort of written in terms of like a teacher or a guru talking to a student, right? And so the first question that a student would come up with is, you claim this thing to be true, but why do I see all this separation in the world? Why do I think there's me and there's all these other people and there's all this stuff, and like what causes this separation? And so here they talk about the separation being the result of error, right? And so the example that they give, and so this is where all the metaphors come in. The example that they give is, imagine you're in the forest in 800 CE, and you're walking through a forest in the middle of the night, and you see something from afar away, and it looks to you like a snake on the ground, right? So you look at the snake, and at the moment you observe it, you're scared, and you're worried there's a snake, but then all of a sudden the clouds part and the moonlight shines on the snake and you recognize it to be a rope, right? So what so the question then becomes, what was reality? Well, the reality was always that this thing was a rope, but for you as an individual, it felt like it was a snake at the point of first encounter, right? And so this is sort of the analogy that they give, which is to say the rope is the reality and it is masked by this illusionary snake. The rope always exists, and it is only through the acquisition of the knowledge that this thing is a rope and not a snake, you actually saw light shine on it and recognized it was a rope, that the snake disappeared and the rope revealed itself, right? And so they claim that this is somewhat analogous to the notion of this Brahman that is veiled through this illusionary power that they call Maya. And this illusionary power is then the apparent cause of all differences in the world. And so as one inquires into Brahman and acquires knowledge, they remove this avidya or ignorance and gain knowledge, and then is able to observe the reality. So they propose different levels of reality, right? And so the first level of reality is what is sort of the apparent reality, the existence of the snake, or if you're asleep, you're like sort of the dream world, right? This is the reality that exists, and then there is the empirical reality that you and I would all agree is real. Like, this is the reality under which I'm giving a presentation, you're listening to me yammer on about some nonsense from 3,000 years ago, right? But the Advaita Vedantas go on and state that there is yet another level of reality that is the absolute reality, and this is the concept of Brahman that I mentioned. And so they use sort of this analogy between the rope and the snake to distinguish between the first and second reality. And then it gets a little bit more dicey when you're talking about the second and third levels of reality, in the sense that the distinction between the second and third reality is not really one of what is true and what is false. There's some technicalities there, find me after. But it is more of sort of different interpretations of the same truth. And so I think a more appropriate analogy comes from the modern Advaita Vedanta philosophers, where they draw from physics. So they kind of like borrow like the distinction between, say, classical mechanics, relativity, and quantum mechanics, right? These are all different perspectives or viewpoints of the same underlying truth, which is the empirical world. But depending on the situation, one might prefer one interpretation versus the other for their application. And that's kind of what they're getting at here. And then lastly, they make some commentaries on the concept of moksha and jivan mukti. So the concept of moksha is present in all of these philosophical systems, whether you're talking about orthodox or heterodox systems, but it is sort of the idea of liberation, whether it be like liberation from suffering or presented as life after death or a heaven, or in the case of Hinduism, escape from a cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, right? And so for the Advaita Vedantins, moksha is achievable through jivan mukti, which is sort of liberation while being alive. And they claim that through the acquisition of knowledge, one recognizes these three different distinct realities to exist. And as soon as you sort of realize these realities exist, you can continue to operate in the empirical world. But because you know that you are sort of this abstract concept that is qualified by existence, consciousness, bliss, you are going to become free from bondage that ties you to the world, or from all suffering. And not only that, but they claim that if done correctly, it allows you to sort of voluntarily take the pleasures of the world as you see fit, without sort of any of the pain that comes along with it. So I think this is a little bit important to delve on, because it's quite a bit different from the other philosophical systems. They're not saying that you have to do good in this world to get something after death, like you go to heaven, or you do something really good and then you're reincarnated as like, you know, a prince in Saudi Arabia or something like this, right? or you know, you die, and when you're born again, you're like you have some niceties, right? It's something that is achievable through practice in the current lifestyle. And I think the yoga system kind of comes pretty close to this idea. And there's very subtle nuances in sort of the philosophy of moksha between these two. But the one sort of big difference is that the Advaita Vedantins don't force you to go into this state of meditation to achieve liberation. It is there and available to you if you just like choose to go down that path. But it is not required. And so it's more of like this customizable philosophy for whatever you want to do. So with that, let's talk about some other things about how one is, how these ideas are communicated and how one is meant to realize this Brahman. As I mentioned, Advaita Vedanta is the school of thought founded by Adi Shankara. His commentaries on the Brahma Sutras are laid out in a certain structure, and that is then followed by subsequent philosophers that comment on this philosophy. And so when you talk about Advaita Vedantin text, or that sort of discusses the philosophical systems and describes the philosophy, it can be categorized in sort of these 5 parts. The first section of the text discusses who is qualified to study Advaita Vedanta or make inquiry into this Brahman, who is qualified to go down this path of knowledge and inquiry. The next section will then go on to discuss some of the statements that are generally agreed upon. So statements that are perceptually true, things that like you and I can agree on. This is my hand, it has 5 fingers. I went to sleep last night and I dreamt something, and then I woke up and now I'm here, right? Like things like this. And then they will make some claim regarding the world. So this is where they'll talk about the concept of Brahman, give these properties, sort of talk about these various levels of reality. And they will make these bold claims about who the state of the self, like when I say the word I, who am I really? Am I the body? Am I the mind? Am I something else? And this is where all these claims are presented. After which they lay out a series of arguments that attempt to logically convince the reader or the student of this philosophical system of that these claims are in fact true. And they will make a particular note in sort of trying to explain the differences between what is claimed and what is thought of as perceptually true. Right. And lastly, I think the most important section is that they lay out a set of actions or practices through which the reader can go on and realize these claims to be true themselves. So they give you like homework, right? And so this all makes sense when you're like talking about the fact that these texts are written are then mimicking the form that this knowledge was handed down throughout century, first by word, then by this formal like structured like teaching system between a student and a teacher, a teacher and a student, and now like the texts are sort of mimicking that that format. So I don't have nearly enough time to dig into these in depth. But I'm going to just talk about that first little bullet point about who is qualified into the inquiry of Brahman, just a little bit. And so this section really starts from the very first sentence of the Brahma Sutras. I am not going to attempt to read the Sanskrit because I don't want to make a fool of myself. But the English translation is, then, therefore, the inquiry into Brahman. Right, so that's like what, six words, and in Sanskrit it's like 2 words, which is the opening sentence of the Brahma Sutras, right? These 555 aphorisms. And the question that is asked by the author, in this case Adi Shankara, is what is the word "then" in this sentence mean, right? So according to Shankaracharya or Adi Shankara, the word "then" here is used to indicate that the inquiry into this Brahman should only be taken upon by someone who has achieved some set of necessary prerequisites. And the Vedas talk about these prerequisites. This is part of the stuff that comes in the stuff that preceded the Upanishads, the other 3 sections. It's all like kind of interwoven in there somewhere.
So then this sentence, then therefore, that comes from the Brahma Sutras, which are old, and then Adi Shankara is taking these older texts and asking, what does this first word mean?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so the way that the Brahma Sutras are a distillation of the content of the Upanishads, which is the last section of each of the 4 Vedas, right? And so there are, because of the fact that like it was expensive to write stuff, right, and communicate, right? Stuff was written down in very terse, like concise manner, and then you would like kind of, it was kind of like a lot of these texts emerged as kind of a teacher talking to a student, right? And like these are really like bright philosophical minds, and the guy just taking notes, right, on some leaf for some piece of paper or whatever they had back then, right? And so they're like, you know, like writing down whatever is the important piece of concept, and so it's like it requires a lot of interpretation and back walking to understand what it means, right? And so Adi Shankara is using the fact that these commentaries are on the Upanishads, and the fact that these are all based on, come after these other contents, and these other contents have talked about this stuff of what you should be doing. And so now you've done all this stuff, and that is the assumption that is being made, and now you are able to continue on. Right? And so depending on which school of orthodox philosophy you go into, they have different interpretation of what are the right necessary prerequisites, how does one achieve them, what is like what one should do, because remember the beginning parts were all rituals and actions and like how those relate to developing a prerequisite. Right, for
examples of some of the prerequisites.
Yeah, so next sentence. So for the purposes of Advaita Vedanta and for the purposes of this conversation, let's talk about these prerequisites in terms of the characteristics of a person, right? And so they, to simplify it like 1000x, the characteristics that we care about are someone that has a questioning personality, right? Someone that's inquisitive, someone who has the desire to know the truth about the world, right? Science heads, the sort of this gut feeling that there is something that is true about the world that is beyond just what I can see around me. And the important one, the ability to discard everything that is then proven to them as non-true, right? So if I can logically convince you that this is not the truth, you should be able to discard it. And lastly, a sentiment that the teacher or the author or whoever the guru is not trying to like pull one over you and make like fool you with like a bunch of nonsense, right? Like just a general like open-mindedness or receptiveness to this knowledge, right? Like so that's at a very, very basic level, and I think like every single person listening to this and every single person that's going to watch this probably has some level of that, right? So yeah.
Sorry, when things are as abstract as the sentence over there, and just a little bit down the slide, you've got the seer and the seen, right? So there's literally one seer, many seen. How can you come to agreement? Because, you know, when you're trying to, like, even for this, for example, talk about agreed upon perception, infer something, support claim, blah, blah, blah. And this is who's qualified to make an inquiry. But the inquiries that they make are essentially going to be based on things that they perceive.
Yes.
So how like, I could perceive X, Y, and Z, you could perceive A, B, and C. We'll never come to an agreement. And there might be logic to both, right?
Yep, and so that was precisely the line of reasoning that predicated the inquiry into language, and predicated like
the Mimamsa that you were talking
the
about.
Mimamsa philosophy, right? And so it's important to keep in mind that like these things are building on top of each other. It's not like they're distinct and disjoint. They are building on top of all the work that came before. And so there have been the Mimamsa philosophers were around maybe like several hundred to 1,000 years before this Vedanta philosophy came about, right? And like I said, the Vedanta philosophy borrows heavily from the Mimamsa philosophy. And so they have sort of hundreds of years of back and forth dialogue about what does the word mean? How do I get you to understand this word? And how do I, when you and I perceive the same thing, how do I know if we're actually perceiving the same thing? Because the only means through which I can verify this is language and communication. And so there are all these back and forth debates about the nuance of language. But for the purposes of making some progress in this, like people sort of accept what is generally like where these consensus end up and try to build on top of that. And the things that are on the fringes, which are not like given as consensus, are sort of like if they might branch off into their own philosophical systems, or they might then like, you know, not be utilized for a particular piece of argument.
Because I just think that for something so fundamental as who is allowed or qualified to make inquiry, when it's that abstract, it's like, you know, you're possibly cutting off an entire branch of people.
Well, so that's why like the Vedanta philosophers, right, like describe these like 5 characteristics, like somebody who wants to know about this stuff, right? Like you have to like kind of, it's like an opt-in system. So like, I'm not going to shove Vedanta philosophy down your throat if you don't care about it, right? But you want to know about this, like you kind of, you have this inclination or this gut feeling of like, there's something beyond just like my day-to-day life. And there's this thing, the metaphysics has maybe some truth to it. Like that is basically all they're saying is like, if you have this, then we can then go down a path of taking exactly where you are and what your understanding you have, and like try to refine that process through the rituals or the actions that were described in the earlier parts of the Vedas. And so those are all about like if I have a characteristic, like how do I really, like if I have a characteristic of knowing the truth, how do I actually develop this, right? And so like, this is kind of like the physics mind, the difference between the physics mindset and like the PhD mindset and like the engineering mindset. Like it's like, how much have you developed this characteristic? Like, have you been able to ask these questions about like whatever, right? And so it's like what everybody at some point is born with these intrinsic characteristics. It's just who goes down and who chooses to develop them and how much, and they try to give you some guidance on how to then go ahead and develop, further improve upon these characteristics. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah. So the book on the right-hand side, Drishya Viveka, literally translates into...
You have 5 minutes.
Huh?
You have 5 minutes.
Oh.
That is not what it translates.
Yeah, I have 5 minutes. Okay, let's run through this. I'm going to skip it. Basically, it's sort of the most basic introductory text. It is structured in the way I described above, but it's only like 100 and some odd pages, and so it's super terse and maybe not super interesting. All right, last slide. So we'll finish this talk through history about how Advaita Vedanta was brought into the West, or how the Vedanta philosophies were brought into the West, mostly by the person picturized here, Swami Vivekananda. So he comes into the West in the end of the 19th century. There's a Parliament of World Religion that's held in Chicago. He gives an opening address there. This is the first real encounter of like Eastern philosophical thought by the Western world. These ideas are then subsequently like they kind of fused together, right? The Eastern philosophies influenced the Western philosophers since then. The Western philosophers have since influenced the Eastern philosophers. And the ideas that he's talking about is not the same stuff that Adi Shankara was talking about 800 year CE, right? Like we've gone through 1,000 years between that and this, and there's been a lot of back and forth, a lot of debate. A lot of these different philosophical systems have kind of crossbred and like shared ideas, and like it's a very different sort of world. And the last point is a lot of his stuff is not pure philosophy. It's like the intersection between philosophy and religion, and so that's what happens when you're at the conference of world religions, not world philosophies. With that, Q&A with whatever time we have left.
So I have a question. So you mentioned like most of the Upanishads and Vedantas, they don't mention any type of God or a name of a God, but most of the Puranas on the other side have mentions of like 300 or 3 billion God names. So for somebody who's not, like I personally is not a big believer of thinking about God, or why was there a transition from such a logical, I would say, questioning mindset of people at 800 BCE to now all the bullshit discussions about religion everywhere? Like why was the transition? Was this because people were not able to understand the questions they were asking? And what do you think personally we should do to go back to more of a questioning mindset rather than agreeing to certain things that everybody should believe in one thing or have the same notion?
Right. So there's the skeptical answer in me, right? And then there's probably the it's not maybe not skeptical so much as the maybe not the most positively framed version of this answer. But there's also like the general idea here is like if you look at any of the major world religions, right? Like you peel back the layers of the onion, right? Peel back like the actions you're supposed to do, and like Hinduism honestly is the absolute worst culprit in this, right? But that's also because it is the oldest of like one of the oldest, right, of the major world religions, and so it has had more time to acquire dust and like all this crud on top of it, right? As opposed to like say Christianity, which is fairly new, and so maybe like not that much dust has acquired on top of it. But if you peel back all of that, like at the end of the day, it's just this philosophical system, right? And so the question really becomes, what is the purpose of philosophy, right? And all philosophy, man, I had a great clip about this. So at the end of the day, all philosophy is about people trying to find happiness in the world. Okay, thank you for showing me your feet. Right, so it's about like trying to get rid of suffering and trying to find happiness, right? And how does one do that? So I don't know. I called out to this great clip from this awesome Indian movie, Three Idiots. Unfortunately, for the non-Indian people in the audience, or the people that haven't seen this movie, like this will be not relevant, and that's why I wanted to show it. But it is the notion of all is well, right? At the end of the day, if you control like your psychology and your mind, then it makes a huge impact on what do you perceive as pleasure or pain, right? And so religious systems are basically that in its current format, right? Like these rituals and stuff like that are just attempts by people to try and distract the mind from the problems that they had at work, or try and distract the mind, and like and then they try to like you do these rituals like, and
You have 30 seconds. We're getting kicked out.
okay, well, we can talk about this later or outside, but basically you do these rituals and